Welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi. My name is Matt.
And my name is James.
And this week on the show, we are looking at two of the very big books of dystopian literature that have been adapted into films. Last week, we were burning books in Fahrenheit 451 and Equilibrium. And this week, we are talking about famous ones.
Yes, very famous books these. A Brave New World and 1984. And we've got a couple of adaptations we're going to be talking about in regards to both of those. Because as you know, this is a movie and occasionally TV podcast, so we like to focus on the visuals because we all love sci-fi visuals.
Yeah, so we'll be talking about why dystopias make for such good books and why these two books in particular are so influential on the genre of dystopia in general.
Yes, definitely. There's lots of heavyweight themes to get into, as we've already discovered, as we've sort of like got into this dystopia series. I think all the films and things we're going to be looking at are quite dense in their subject matter, and I think A Brave New World and 1984 are particularly dense in their themes, and there's lots going on which I'm really interested to sort of like discuss with you, Matt. I think there's going to be a lot of dense conversation, to say the least.
Well, shall we get started with Brave New World then?
Yeah, let's go to A Brave New World right now.
Mankind is. Oh, brave new world.
So, Brave New World, primarily we're talking about the 1980 TV movie version, directed by Burt Brinkerhoff. There are other adaptations as well. Other adaptations are available. But this is the primary one that we're looking at. This one's available on YouTube if you're interested in checking it out. I believe you can get it on DVD as well. But hey, why do that? It's on YouTube.
Yeah, head over to YouTube and watch it. And yeah, as always, we're going to be talking about this in spoilerific detail. So if you don't want to know about it, yeah, head over to YouTube and watch that beforehand. But yeah, we chose the 1980s version. One, because it was easily accessible, and two, because it's very true to the book from what we were reading about doing our research beforehand. So there's also been a version released in 1998, which had Leonard Nimoy in, and the guy from the OC, I forget his name, but the dad from the OC's in it. I saw in the pictures.
Oh, yeah.
And,
Sandy.
Sandy. I should probably know the actor's name, but I do not. So that one apparently sort of deviates quite a lot from the source material. So we didn't want to go too much towards that. And there's also been a TV show released recently in 2019, which I might talk about a little bit as well, because I did watch a couple of episodes of that just before, just to sort of get an idea of how it's been updated, because this version is very 1980s, isn't it, Matt?
1980s, 1970s, yeah, it's right in that period, and it feels very much like a TV production. I would say, like, straight at the top, especially for anyone who is listening this far into the podcast and hasn't seen it and aren't sure if they're going to, it was good. It was a good film, but it took some adjusting to, because it looks like shit. It looks like a 1980 TV movie, sci-fi TV movie in particular. But I really got into it a lot, and I really thought it was very good. So yeah, I do recommend it as well if you haven't seen it.
Yeah, and I think that is because the story is so engaging. Like the idea that, like the ideas present in A Brave New World are really interesting. And so Aldous Huxley wrote this in 1932, and it was kind of written as a parody novel initially to H.G. Wells's A Modern Utopia, which was like back in 1905. And that was the source material, as we discussed previously in another episode, for Things to Come, which we've already covered. And knowing this sort of started off in Huxley's mind as a kind of parody of that utopia, I think was a really interesting way to go into this film as well, because Things to Come was very sort of about like making progress and moving towards the future and industrialization, and man needs to strive for better things and more technological advancements. And this kind of shows the parallel of that. And Huxley has referred to this as like a negative utopia, which I think is something which we've been referring to as sort of a a dystopia in disguise.
Yeah, it's the same concept, isn't it, that he was talking about there. It's really interesting that he used that. I also love the way that we're kind of hearing about how all these writers were influenced by each other, but a lot of the language we see when we're researching it is like it was written in response to or written as a parody of, which makes it all sound very gossipy, which I really enjoy. When we talk about films, like, oh, this really reminded me of this film, it's like, well, yeah, the director was influenced by it. That's a completely normal thing. And it's also totally normal to happen in the world of literature. But I don't know, it's sometimes dressed up in these gossipy terms, like it's a parody of H.G. Wells' work,
Yeah, it's a weird thing to think about, isn't it? But obviously, everything's sort of a reflection of something else in some way or some manner. And what they always say is like, no ideas are original. There's always something that someone's got an idea from. But I remember when we talked about Things to Come, you were talking about how you wanted it to show a bit more of that darker side of the utopia. And I think this sort of really gets into that as well, doesn't it? Because it is supposed to be this utopian society that they're living in, but it's very flawed, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just kind of like socially empty, isn't it? It's extremely facile and just sort of depressing. And but it is a utopia. It sort of delivers on everything it promises, this society. Everyone is blissfully happy, like, all the time. Well, apart from, I mean, Bernard's kind of like got questions, and his friend Helmholtz is also, he's not totally happy. These characters aren't totally happy there, but they're outliers, aren't they? And everyone really loves living in this world state that they live in and just like blissing out on their soma and having sex with everybody all the time.
Yeah, there's lots of drugs and lots of sex, and that seems to be how their society is working so well from the outside looking in. But yeah,
lots of sex and drugs, but no rock and roll.
Yeah, no rock and roll. They just listen
to music and jingles.
Yeah, little sort of like elevator tunes is kind of like the main thing that they're listening to. But let's talk about the society itself then. So what is the society in A Brave New World? What is it, and how do they live?
So like I said, it's they're all blissed out on drugs. They take soma, and they don't really talk about it in terms of addiction, do they? But they are seemingly addicted to this drug, or at least they use it constantly all the time and can't get by without it. So, by any definition, I'd say that's an addiction. But they don't think of it like that. They love their soma. It keeps them happy. And they engage with each other. It's like a dirty word to enter into a romantic, monogamous relationship. And certainly having biological children, that hasn't happened for years in this society. They're all in vitro children, but you do have lots of sex with lots of different people all the time. But the most prevalent thing I noticed when the film started was the kind of caste system they have. Right, they've got their alphas, betas, gammas, and epsilons. I don't know if there was any other castes involved in that, but in that order is their kind of like superiority in society, right?
Yeah, and it's so much based on whether you're an alpha or a beta and so on and so forth. And yeah, you see sort of like there's kind of like an innate kind of prejudice about it, but they deal with it in a way that it's just the norm. So like if you're an alpha, you are on top of that ladder. You are getting the best jobs. You have the most power. Whereas if you're lower down, going right down to sort of epsilons, which are sort of like, it's the way they look as well, because in this depiction of it, you've got the alphas, which are supposed to be the pinnacle of humanity and society. They're like beautiful human beings. And then you've got lower down, when you get down to the epsilons, they look like zombies. They've got really big sort of black bags around their eyes. They're all dressed in sort of like blue sort of janitor uniforms, whereas you've got the alphas, which are in these sort of like golden jumpsuits, and the betas, which are in these sort of like red garbs. And it's also signifying of their position. But I found it really interesting in this as well, because the way they go down the ladder, when you get to like, I think it's the gammas, basically they're saying that if you've got curly brown hair, you're going to be a gamma, and that seems to be the only signifier.
Not all, but lots of them have afros.
Yeah,
which was interesting.
And it's like white guys and girls with afros as well, isn't it? It's like, but it's the same two people who play all of the gammas.
Was it?
Well, it looked
I know
like
that we
it.
saw. We certainly saw one pair of gammas. Yeah, you're right. We saw one. We see one pair of gammas doing a vast array of jobs. Actually, that's a really interesting point because it's a TV movie. I didn't think too much of it. I just thought, we haven't got the budget. They'll just do every gamma role. But it didn't actually cross my mind that they might be. Are you implying that they might be different gammas, different characters?
That's what I thought.
But they all look identical.
Yeah.
There's like two molds of gamma. That's really interesting. That hadn't really crossed my mind. What I really liked about the gammas is they're the most brainwashed of all four casts, because you've got the epsilons that don't actually really speak, and they're basically a slave caste doing all the dangerous and difficult jobs to mine the helium and stuff like that they use to power the society. And the alphas and betas, I didn't see much distinction between the alphas and the betas, except that like alphas had more senior jobs and betas were a little bit more blue collar. But the gammas were right in the middle, where those two that we always see are always just like repeating little gamma slogans, little rhymes about how lovely it is to be a gamma, because to be any smarter wouldn't be any nice, and to be any stupider would be an epsilon. We're right in the middle. It's nice to be a gamma. They're the most like brainwashed, aren't they?
Yeah, they reminded me of when we watched and talked about Free Guy over on Patreon. Like they're sort of stock video game characters, and they've got their phrases that they say every time. So it felt a lot like that.
Yeah, totally. They've got no autonomy really. But what was so interesting was how happy they are with it. Like explicitly, they are delighted to be a gamma because of the soma. They take the soma all the time. The soma keeps them happy. And the conditional training that they've had throughout their growing up means that they don't think beyond any of that. They are perfectly happy with their place in life, which was a really interesting concept in the dystopia sense, because I was trying to get my head around the idea of like how bad is it to be in this society, and particularly for the gammas and the epsilons by extension, because the epsilons don't really speak. You don't hear them like voicing these opinions, but you can kind of assume that the epsilons are also blissfully happy with being slaves, and the gammas are explicitly blissfully happy with being in their menial jobs and just getting on with things. It's sort of a horrifying scenario because they've got no like autonomy over their own lives, but they are undeniably blissfully happy. So I was trying to like weigh up like it's morally wrong to create this world and make people live this way, but if you were born as a gamma, all you would know is happiness. And like, is that such a bad thing? Like, you don't choose your own life, but you will be happy in your life.
Yeah, it's like, it's such a weird concept as well, because they're all basically just doped up the whole time, but they're happy to be doped up. Like, that's just how their society works. But the thing I found really interesting is obviously there's no war or violence, and part of that is because there's no emotion really, is there? Like, the whole reason they've got this sort of free love sexual society is so that nobody sort of builds those kind of emotional connections. And in doing that, they try and sort of like pass it off as, you don't get jealous, so you're not going to get angry, because there's no sort of like idea of jealousy, because no one belongs to anybody else. Everyone and everything is free. So you always have what you need, and there's no sort of like, there's nothing that you have to have or you need to get. Everything is sort of like provided for you. And because everyone just is happy in their social station, because they don't know anything else and they can't think of anything else, because they've got kind of like you said, either no autonomy or no sort of like desire to look for anything different. It's sort of like, that's taking out all of the emotional elements of everything that's human. And again, it's this dehumanization of these characters. They're just happy to be doing what they're doing, but that's because they don't have any thoughts or free will of their own.
Yeah, I don't want to jump too far ahead in the plot, but I suppose it doesn't matter. But at the end of the film, that's the kind of the challenge to the society, is that John demands the right to be unhappy. That's the point that Aldous Huxley is making, I guess, that like rejecting this sort of surface level happiness, just being doped up and having no autonomy, it's better to reject that and choose the more difficult life because it's more real and authentic, and it's an authentic human experience of life, which I do agree with. I just couldn't I couldn't get past this idea that like it might be it looks nice to be a gamma. I have autonomy over my life. I can choose to do anything, and I've had jobs that I absolutely hate, and I did it for years. I was very unhappy, and I was like, well, I could have just been a gamma, just chilling out at the front desk, taking my soma every day.
But I think you've got no idea what real happiness is, though, in that case, because if you've never been sad, then you don't know what it's like to be happy, do you? And it's this whole sort of like, you can't really feel those emotions if you haven't had the other side. And I think when some of these characters do start to feel those emotions, it changes them, and it's sort of like it's their characters and their personalities start to come out, and they become a bit more like they're not just drones going about like they normally would. They're intrigued by stuff. They're curious, and I think this sort of like this innate thing that humans are curious about things. They want to find out more. You've got none of that because you're just walking around as a drone.
Yeah, so that's most presented through Helmholtz, who I mentioned before, who's Bernard's friend and becomes John's friend, and Lenina, who is the one that kind of, I guess, falls in love with John, but her ability to sort of feel and understand love is obviously very confused because of the society that she's grown up in. But we see them their interactions with John allow them to start to break free, like you say, and sort of see the world as it really is and start to experience, human emotions. I love the idea that Helmholtz is a jingle writer. So he has this creative job in this horribly uncreative society where there is no creativity. It's all about production, consumption, disposal, and then back to production. So he creates the jingles for those things that just have to be endlessly produced and discarded. But within that tiny little element of creativity, he's like, it's breaking him free from all the other people because he just actually wants to explore this creative niche that he has in his brain and allow that to expand. He basically wants to write beautiful music, but the only way he can express himself is through quite simple, boring jingles. That felt more 1970s, early 1980s than it did 1930s, I think. I don't know what Helmholtz's job was in the book, but it felt like something that was more from the modern interpretation of it, having be a jingle writer.
Yeah, and I know in the 2019 TV version, Helmholtz is actually played by a woman, and she's a fashion designer. So they've kind of got that element of the creativity in there, yet it's also got the because both of those roles and jobs are consumerist sort of like professions, aren't they? Because you're producing a product which is going to be digested by people in that sort of consumerist manner. Like jingles are just used to sell things, and fashion is sort of like it's all about buying the product, isn't it? So even though they're both creative, they're both about making a product, and so much of this society is sort of like consumerism as well. And Huxley was kind of basing this around this connection that he has to Henry Ford. So when he was over in America, he was reading this book about Henry Ford's life, and in that it was sort of talking about like these principles of like assembly lines and mass production and sort of predictability and all this kind of stuff that they used for like making cars. And he also, like, when Huxley went to visit America, he was seeing this sort of like this world that was very sort of, it was different to what he'd experienced over in the UK. And he was sort of like seeing sort of this new culture of youth and sort of commercial cheeriness and sort of sexual promiscuity and all this kind of stuff was sort of like coming to the forefront in America. And he was seeing this and he was like, oh, this is different. This could go a completely different way. So I think that was informing some of his decisions in writing A Brave New World. And this sort of consumerist aspect is everywhere in the sort of like adaptations of the book as well. Like Soma is a consumerist product, isn't it? It's a drug that everybody has. And again, in the TV show, the 2019 one, they do Soma in different sort of colors and has different effects. And it's all sort of like, it's making it more like a product that people have. And it's like, oh, do you want to try a yellow one or an orange one? Or like this one will do this to you. And it makes it a bit more sort of like consumerist in that way. And again, in the 1980s version, they've got lots of other stuff going on. Like they talk about, like they have the weird sorts of rooms where they go and have like hallucinations almost, but they're like, it's like a VR hallucination. Like the moment where Bernard is imagining himself as a gladiator, and it's like he's having this
feelies.
Yeah, the feelies, that's it. So they've got like places where they can go to sort of have those emotional moments and sort of vents, but then also it's like, why do they need to? Again, it's like a consumerist kind of thing.
Yeah, even emotions have been commodified and then presented back to people as something that can be consumed and then discarded like everything else. There's some nice scenes where they're just like tossing stuff in the bin in this film. I think it's like their clothes, maybe, like they just change outfit and then it just goes straight in the bin, the thing they were wearing.
And it's the same with food as well, because when John finally meets Bernard and they're on the plane, there's a moment when he's showing them the food. And John's just pressing the button trying to get loads of food. And then he's like, oh, actually, I don't really want to eat this right now.
Yeah.
But I was like, it's fine. We'll just throw it in the bin. It'll just be recycled and we'll use it again.
Yeah. And I really like that scene as well. That's like John's, what is it? It's like a mobile sort of campsite that he has when he's out visiting the Savage Reservation. But he offers John like entertainment on the screen. And then he's like, oh, none of it's any good. I can just show you a view of outside if you'd like. And it's like he's taken him in from the reservation and then he's just showing him like a digital picture of the reservation as entertainment.
Primitive females gave viviparous birth to young.
Like animals?
Yes, physiologically, exactly like animals. I understand your reactions. Perhaps we should take a brief Soma break.
So we should talk about those characters and kind of the story that's going on in A Brave New World as well. So like the adaptation we watched, it's quite long in its story arc. So it goes into great detail about how John and Bernard are born. So Bernard is a product of a mistake that's happened in the sort of like the assembly line of people where they sort of like put all their genetics together and they make these human beings. And John is a child that was born on the Savage Lands to a couple which weren't supposed to be there. They were like on holiday and he ended up living in the Savage Lands. But it goes into sort of like their story at the start, and then it sort of turns into this weird sort of love triangle bit at points between Bernard, John, and Lenina, and then it sort of like spirals off from there. But I think those are the essential characters, isn't it? It's sort of like it's showing you this society from Bernard and John's perspective, and showing you sort of like the cracks in the utopia.
Yeah, John's the outsider coming into the dystopia and having an outside perspective, but also he's someone who views it as a utopia and really wants to go there because of what he's been told by his mother. So he really is like he's passionate and really wants to believe in the utopia, but he is completely disappointed with it and exposes the dystopia for what it really is. I thought that there was an interesting kind of presentation in this film because I don't think it's taken from the book, which is in the kind of first half when Bernard and John are shown growing up simultaneously, one in the World State and one in the Savage Reservation. It kind of gave me this feeling that like these two characters were going to come together and kind of overthrow the dystopia or challenge the dystopia as a pair, as a unit, because Bernard is he's an outsider, isn't he? He's unusual. He's more intelligent than anyone and he doesn't fit in and he doesn't get along. And John is more literally an outsider. He's coming from the outside. So I kind of thought they were going to like form this little pair and then challenge the dystopian society. But that's not the way it goes. And Bernard actually kind of falls back into the dystopia because he kind of becomes a celebrity by bringing John in. and he loves that, and he completely like falls back into it and turns into a real shit, doesn't he? He's like not a very nice person by the end of the film.
Yeah, I think because they're both kind of outsiders, aren't they? Because Bernard he's supposed to be an alpha plus, but he is physically different. Like he's shown as being sort of like the weedier guy amongst the other kids. Yeah, and he's always sort of like, he's always curious about things and always doing things to a level that he's not supposed to be doing them to. Like he will excel at certain aspects of his academic life, whereas he's supposed to just do it to that level and stop. And this is really sort of like, it's all sort of orchestrated a bit by Mustafa Mond as well, who is like this character who is overseeing this life that Bernard is living, because he knows about the sort of like the mistake in the assembly line at the start. So he's interested to find out what's happening with Bernard and how his life goes. And then when John's introduced, his interest sort of goes away from Bernard onto John more, because here's this example of something that's completely different to everything else in his society. John still has that connection to that utopian society by his parents.
And he becomes, everyone's obsessed with John, aren't they? Because he's come in from the outside. But I like the way that he was really welcomed into the society, even though he just couldn't fit in, he didn't fit in, and his very presence there was like causing massive societal problems, because he was like challenging Soma and the nature of death and all of that. But everyone's still obsessed with him. Everyone just loves this little oddity quirk, because he's like an alluring savage that's come in. Everyone's just following him around and stuff.
Yeah, it's like, obviously it's ironic that they call him John the Savage, because he's so eloquent in everything that he says, because he's always reciting Shakespeare and all of these sort of like poetic quotes throughout the film. And I also found just like his look quite comical. Obviously it's dated because it's like the 1980s, but he's got like this hilarious stuck on blonde beard from the looks of it. And he's wearing like He-Man loincloth like around his midsection.
That's generous. I describe it more as like a homemade nappy.
A homemade nappy. But it's because he's got the furry boots as well to make him look a bit like a caveman. And he's just, because they've made him, because he's supposed to be this product of the utopian couple, he's sort of like, they make him blonde as well, and a bit sort of like, it's got like Aryan undertones to it, because he's supposed to be like an alpha, so he's supposed to look like that. And I think that adds another element to it, because it's kind of like it's eugenics and shit like that that's going on underneath.
Well, it's sort, yeah. I mean, it's sort of literally is eugenics, because of all they breed everyone in a lab. But it's not the kind of selective eugenics, the racially selective eugenics, because they have all sorts of alphas, don't they?
Yeah, although you could argue sort of like the way that the gammas look as well is specifically sort of like it's down there. And then when they go to the Savage Land as well, everyone, like, it's quite a racist depiction, because everyone kind of looks like Latino as well, don't they? Or like Native American.
Do they? I didn't clock that.
Everyone kind of has dark hair and darker features. And it's really sort of like, it's quite prominent in the quote unquote savage lands. And even like the look of it looks like sort of like a desert town. And they've sort of got all of that aspect to it, which is a bit questionable.
It's interesting, isn't it? Like, what I understand about the book from reading up was that the reservation they go to is in South America, I think, and they visit actual sort of isolated tribes there.
Because it looks very South American. That's what I kept thinking.
Do you reckon? Because I didn't think it did. I thought, because it looks like a destroyed sort of Western European town. They find a Model T car there, don't they? Like it looked more like a post-apocalyptic, Western European modern civilization that's fallen to ruin. I didn't think it looked like an isolated South American tribe.
Nah, in my head, I was kind of like thinking of places like Mexico and like things like that, and sort of like those smaller sort of towns out in the sort of more deserty, climated places. It's kind of like that's what I had. And then obviously that makes John stand out even more because he's this sort of like Aryan white guy just amongst all of these other people which don't look like him at all.
Yeah, but he looks like Keir Dullea, of course, his father, Tomakin, his natural father.
Tomakin.
So it kind of sets it up to be like, oh, he's going to fit in. He's going to like find his home. He doesn't fit in the reservation, so he's going to like go to the world state and he's going to like totally fit in there. But of course, it doesn't play out that way. And looking like your father, of course, is not a benefit in the world state because having a biological father is a complete taboo. No one reproduces that way, and it's actually really disgusting, and it ruins Tomakin's life when John shows up and calls him father, I think.
Yeah, and everyone's sort of disgusted by it. They're like, even when he's referring to Linda as his mother, he's like, everyone's like, no, you can't say that. We won't have this kind of vulgar language around here. And it's just so like, it's the reaction to the two different societies like colliding. Like also the whole idea of monogamy is seen as a disgusting thing in this society. Like, why would you just sort of like have one partner? You need to be sharing yourself, and it's a selfish thing to do. And it's so interesting seeing these two parallels.
I thought that was a more interesting way of kind of reacting to how emotions cause the negative things like war and violence. Thinking back to what we looked at in Equilibrium on the last episode, you know, where, because I was a bit confused over how like family units would work in Equilibrium. Like, what's the point? Like, if you've got no emotions at all, then what's the point in forming any kind of family unit and still raising your own children? It's like a risk to that anti-emotional thing. I thought Huxley's vision of, well, I don't know how much of the kind of artificial insemination stuff was in the book because that, you know, that wouldn't have been around then, but you know, not having monogamous relationships in order to avoid any emotions, which could then possibly lead to the negative emotions that then lead to war and violence. That actually makes a lot more sense to me. I think that's a much more well fleshed out idea. And I guess I shouldn't be surprised that Aldous Huxley, a famous author, had a more fleshed out idea than Equilibrium.
Makes sense. But yeah, because I suppose like not having the family units as well and not having those connections to other people in the same way, kind of, it makes everyone so more like inner. They're like interior in their sort of like motives, but it's hard to sort of like explain, but it's like, it's something to do with the fact that they're not really concerned with themselves or other people. They're so in love with their servitude that they're sort of like, they're happy to go about doing what they're doing. But in doing that and not having a family unit around you, you've got nothing to care about. So it makes the idea of death sort of like an easier concept to try and pass off as something which is just like a happy thing, because there's no loss in death for these people, because when they die, they haven't got those connections, have they? Everything is recycled and reused again. So they've kind of got that mentality in the society sort of ingrained into them.
Yeah, yeah. Again, it was one of those things where I was like, oh, it doesn't sound so bad. But like to come back to your point. It's
renewable resources and all this kind of stuff.
Or just like the fact that they've kind of like, they've got beyond the kind of emotional devastation of losing a loved one because you have no loved ones and you've been raised to have a different opinion about death. But it comes back to your point about like, you have to, understanding sadness and grief allows you to appreciate happy emotions.
Yeah. And you've got like, you have no desire to get anywhere in your life or do anything that could be important. Like no one would have any sort of like drive to create something new or cure a disease or like things like that. If there's no sort of like reason for anything, you just don't do anything.
Some of them do have that drive, don't they? Like there's the guy who makes films, I think, early in the film, who wants to be creative and wants to create something, and he gets stamped down by Mustafa Mond, who's like, yeah, but make it simpler, take out the emotion. And, we don't want people asking why, and we don't want people thinking about progress or thinking about the past. So just dial down all of that stuff, please. So there is that kind of like, people have that desire to create and develop and progress, but it is stamped down gently and politely, but it is stamped down when it comes up.
Yeah, and I mean, all the conditioning stuff sort of aids that, doesn't it? Because like he's doing a promotional film to sort of talk about the conditioning and sort of how people should be living their lives, and just even the way they look at like nature and just they have a like they're trained that when they're near flowers, something will like spray at them, and they want to stay away from that. And then like all of the weird games that the kids were playing, like hide the zipper they kept referring to, which sounded really dodgy for a bunch of kids to be playing. And
the children also have like primary erotic education. Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Which we thankfully don't see too much of. That they don't go into that, but it's heavily implied that they're teaching the kids about the polygamy in society. But they're like young kids. They're like under 10.
Yeah.
And John is rightfully horrified when he's shown that class and he has to run out, I think.
And the plop game as well, which
what was like, the plop game?
The plop game, when they were like so they've got all these in there, the way that when they die, they're sort of frozen to the point where they look good, and then they're put back into the sort of like renewable energy or whatever it is, and they play the plop game, which is they go around the morgue, basically, these kids, and press a button, and then they drop these dead bodies down into whatever recycling system they're in, which is just, and they're all just like plop, plop, plop. And it made me laugh, but it's also like a horrible thing.
Yeah, pretty horrible, but objectively it looked like fun.
It sounds like you want to live in a society, Matt. You're like, the games look fun. You don't have to do much. You can sort of like just be blissfully happy.
I mean, I would 100% try Soma if it was offered to me.
Do you want to play the plop plop game? Yeah! Well, have you all finished your yum yum Soma candy?
Yeah!
Since you've all been very, very good on our whole death training picnic, I guess it's time for your reward. Each one gets one plop plop.
Yay!
But just one. Go on. All right, children. All together.
Death is perfect, death is fun, death is good for everyone.
Good. Very good.
Somebody get this man some Soma.
I think you're right. You've obviously got a much more mature reaction to it, which is that, like, you know, sadness and grief allows you to appreciate your more happy emotions. But yeah, I was very taken in by the idea of, oh, just get rid of sadness and grief.
Shall I tell your girlfriend you're up for this polygamy, this society of free love? I wonder what she'll think about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they all seem to be having fun, but like, yeah, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that aspect of it. And obviously, yeah, they're not experiencing the kind of the love of monogamy. But again, it's the same thing as equilibrium. It's the idea that like that's the trade-off that society has accepted to get rid of the negative emotions of violence that lead to war.
But it's quite hypocritical, the entire society, though, isn't it? Like, it's got all of these sort of inbuilt things, but then you've got Mustafa, who is sort of like, he's familiar with all of this stuff. Like, he's a alpha plus, isn't he? And he's sort of the guy who's in charge. He's got like an extra little T on the side of his jumpsuit, so everybody knows he's the leader. But he is so intrigued. He's got this curiosity as to sort of why Bernard and John are the way they are and about emotions. And he knows Shakespeare, and he's got like an entire treasure trove of books and literature and sort of stuff that no one really is supposed to have around. So that kind of brings up a lot of contradiction in him as well, too. What wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it's the same sort of hypocrisy. He's like he's the world leader sort of role, and he has access to all of these things that no one else has access to because he has to understand all of it in order to keep it out, basically. Which is something that we're seeing so far pretty much all the time in a dystopia, is that there's going to be hypocrisy at the very top. And yeah, Mustafa's like, he's a very like cheery character in this film, but he's just sort of meddling in people's lives and then banishing them to some place they don't want to go to. In Bernard's case,
it's either Antarctica or like Hawaii or somewhere. So it's two different extremes.
But it works out very nicely for Helmholtz because he actually wants that. He wants to be banished and he wants to go and explore his creativity in peace. And he's like, he's actively saying like, no, not Fiji. That sounds too nice. Send me somewhere grim and miserable. I want to make art. I must suffer for my art.
Yeah, he's very much that kind of character, isn't he?
I did feel a bit like Helmholtz was in for a nasty surprise as someone who, you know, he was obviously like, he was leaning towards this and wanting to break free from it. But he is someone raised on Soma and raised on the conditioning and all of that, to then be sent off to some desolate island to create music that he doesn't even understand properly because he only writes jingles. I sort of felt like a bit of a nasty surprise in store for Helmholtz. I'm sure he will create some great art after the fact, but it's going to be a bumpy ride for him. And he probably should have maybe gone to Fiji first, just to ease into that lifestyle.
Yeah. I mean, if you sort of like draw the comparison between sort of him and Linda. So Linda had that shock to the system when she was cast out into the Savage Lands by accident because she like fell over a cliff or something, didn't she? It was like she was blown away by one of the guns.
Yeah, very.
She goes
funny,
flying
very
off
funny.
and then it's just left in the desert. And I mean, also just during that scene as well, like the weird little inflatable lovemaking bed that they have, but it's not even a bed. It's like a weird tent where they just get in and start banging.
And it's not even a tent, is it? Because it's not enclosed.
No. It's like, it's so weird.
It's just a frame. But yeah, Linda's a good example because Linda ends up becoming addicted to, is it mezcal they're drinking? So you're quite right that it is South American influence because mezcal is a South American drink like tequila, isn't it? So yeah, there is that element to it. But she becomes addicted to that. She's an alcoholic. She misses the Soma to the point where when she comes back, she immediately goes into like a Soma coma and will be in that until she dies. She's like, hook it up to my veins. I just want Soma and then death. I've had a miserable time outside of the world state. Just hook me back up.
And like also she can't get to grips with the way that the Savage Lands work in terms of the society as well, because she's trying to be promiscuous and she's trying to sleep with all these men, but then all their wives get really upset and like come at her door and start like beating her up. And she just like, she's got no concept of this and she thinks that she's doing the right thing because again, it's so indoctrinated into her that if she's not doing it, she's like, this is bad. I need to be doing the right thing. And it's just this brainwashing that's happened.
Yeah, she's learned all these rules and now she can't apply it to her life in the reservation.
Whereas sort of like Bernard is the opposite, isn't he? Because he's obsessed with Lenina and he doesn't engage with anyone. He keeps to himself because he's just like naturally just a bit more withdrawn. And he's got this connection to this one person who's shown him a bit of attention. And it's so interesting seeing how they sort of like, they live in those two different worlds and just the way that's like still individualism is coming across and it's coming through, but it's seen as a defect.
Yeah, which is why I kind of thought Bernard and John were going to like team up in that way. But I thought it was interesting that it just didn't play out the way I expected. It was actually quite satisfying that it went another way for those characters. And there's some really good performances in this film as well. Like Linda is fantastic. Bud Cort as Bernard, I really thought was really good as well. He's got like a kind of like, his physicality is so good for the role. Like he's really like small and like kind of hunched up, and he looks like he doesn't fit in as an alpha. But then when he like seizes on the opportunity to get fame and fortune, basically, he really like his whole personality changes. It's brilliant. And Mustafa Mond as well.
Yeah,
he's so benevolent and terrifying at the same time. It's a great dystopian figurehead, really, that he's not threatening at all, but he has all of this power to destroy your life, and he exercises it pretty freely. Even doing it to people that he's engineered a situation where they have to be exiled, and he just doesn't care.
Yeah, that's it. And I mean, because they're both, so Bernard and John are basically outcasts in the society, whichever way you look at it. They don't fit in the way that they're supposed to. And that all leads to them getting exiled. They're cast off into these different places where, because they're past the point of no return, they can't be reformed, and they're causing upsets in the society. They're starting riots. like really strange riots where nobody seems to know exactly what's going on. And then you see the use of like the peace gas in Things to Come. They've got like soma gas. So they use this to sort of like calm everybody down when they're having these riots. But it's interesting that the only place that they can go when they've been sort of outcast from society is into exile. And exile isn't seen as the way we've seen it in other dystopian fiction so far. It's not sort of like you want to go there for the freedom. They're sort of like they're exiled in a way where it's not sort of like this big release. It's kind of like they have to go there. They've got no other option.
Well, that's true for if you're like fully bought into the society, and if you're still a sort of functioning member of it, which is what Bernard is, and it's actually what he becomes. He doesn't start out in the story as like a functioning member of it, but then he buys into the dystopia when he sort of finds success and he wants to continue. So exile is a punishment for him, but for Helmholtz and John, they want to be exiled, don't they? Like I said, Helmholtz wants to go and create his art, and all John wants is to get away from this horrible society and have the freedom to be unhappy. So for those characters, if you're not getting along with the dystopia, then exile is a reward and is actually something that you can get along with and sort of try and form a life for yourself. It was really, really tragic that like Mustafa Mond wouldn't allow John to do that. Like there was an opportunity for John to enjoy exile and live a happy life on his own, but that challenges society too much just in its existence. And then like that, the torment that Mustafa Mond puts him through in the last sort of half hour or whatever was really grim. Sending the documentary maker, all of that stuff, you know?
Yeah, it's like he's put into sort of like a zoo, isn't he? Like he's seen as this creature that they'll go and visit and then sort of like take a look at and sort of laugh at, and then they depict him in this promotional film as this comedy figure who's always doing stupid things, and he's sort of like, he's primitive, he is the savage.
But in producing comedy out of his life, they're still kind of like creating a pleasurable commodity, which is a comedic film, but using that pleasurable commodity as a means of control. So there's an implicit threat there, which is that if you choose exile, you will become this figure of fun. This is the life that you'll live. But still, Huxley's presentation of that threat is commodified as a pleasurable product. It's still like it's a comedy feely that the people enjoy watching, but there's a threat underlying that comedy.
Yeah, and it's like, it's tragic as well, because the whole reason that John goes into exile is because he can't be with Lenina as well. And he wants to be with Lenina, but it seems to him that she is still sort of living in that society and doesn't have the same kind of feelings for him. So that's why they never engage. They never sort of like get to that point where they are sort of like in a relationship. And it's sort of like, it's all building towards that, and then it makes it even more tragic that she finally turns up at sort of like the compound where John is, and he sees her, and it's like, it looks like it's going to happen, and then the soma gas kicks in. She's sort of like, she's still alive. John thinks she's not, and then of course you get that final scene with John where he hangs himself, which is just, I didn't see it coming, but it fits with this because it's like, it's bleak, isn't it?
It's bleak, and also John's entire education has been basically reading Shakespeare. That's the only like literature that he had access to when he was outside in the reservation. And he basically has this Romeo and Juliet ending, doesn't he? He mistakenly, I don't think Lenina's dead at the end. She's in a soma-induced sleep, but he thinks she's dead. It's a Romeo and Juliet tragic ending where he thinks that she's dead, so he takes his own life. So he's kind of like, he's fulfilling that education that he's had, which is only really understanding the world through Shakespeare. So it's very melodramatic. It's a melodramatic response that he has. But it's also like, well, he thinks it's the right thing to do because he was raised on Shakespeare. Your lover is dead. I must kill myself. I'm not trying to take away like his grief, like it was like a natural response as well, but like it is the Shakespearean response to that.
Yeah, and he's kind of like he knows he's not happy in the space that he's in, and that's the only sort of like action he can take at that point. But still, it's just like it's quite harrowing the way they show it at the end. And then you've got Mustafa sort of like reading a line from The Tempest as well, like the one about dreams, and it's just a very, very sad ending to a film and story that you never get the dystopian revolution that we're so used to seeing in sort of like dystopian fiction now. The moment where everybody's free and they're out of this society and there's like a happy ending. You don't get that in this. And it's similar for the next film we're going to talk about, isn't it?
Yeah, we've got two dystopias today where the idea of revolution is kind of introduced and is discussed in the film, but it doesn't quite work out that way, and these dystopias are not easily defeated. So after the break, we'll be talking about 1984's 1984.
Matt, I know we've just been talking about how bad consumerism societies are and addiction, but if you are addicted to the podcast and you're looking to become a consumer and consume more episodes, more stuff from us, more chat, more sci-fi chat, you can find us over on Patreon. So you can head over there and find bonus episodes and extra content.
Yes, come on over to patreon.com/journeythroughsci-fi and enjoy the soma of bonus episodes like the Animatrix, Palm Springs, we did Red Dwarf special over there, The Vast of Nights, and many, many more. So come on over and enjoy that. Enjoy the consumerism of supporting your favourite podcast.
In 1949, George Orwell had a vision of the future. Today, that vision is still a best-selling novel, and his prophecy remains as terrifying as ever.
If you want a vision of the future, Winston, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
A future where freedom becomes slavery, where privacy is forbidden, the past forgotten, and where living people simply vanish. Yet one man and one woman dare to love.
Can you get Sunday afternoon off?
Yes.
Take this.
Everyone knows. The thing that is in room 101 is the worst thing in the world.
This production, makes a specific reference to the fact that it was made in 1984, specifically May 1984, which is when the film is set, and it's set in London and it was shot in London. But I was just like, so what? It came up in the credits at the end that it was shot in the time and place that George Orwell set it, and obviously it was released in 1984, the year that it's set. It's sort of interesting to release it in the year that it was set, but I didn't think it was too interesting that it was filmed in April 1984. The dates in Winston's diary. I just didn't get that.
I don't know. I think it's really clever marketing, because if you're gonna if you're gonna do 1984 and you're gonna make a film of it, if you could make it in 1984, then it kind of adds that extra element to it. Like you're telling that story at the time. Although, luckily, the world depicted in the film and the book is not the world of 1984. It's not that bleak totalitarian society, which we're going to talk about now.
Yeah, so this is quite a big one for me because I'd never seen it. I hadn't seen Brave New World either, but I'd argue that that's not as famous and influential as 1984. And the main reason that I hadn't seen it was that it's one of those films that I really wanted to read the book before I saw the film. And I still hadn't done that when we were prepping for this podcast. So yesterday, I read the entire book.
I loved it
before watching the film. Yeah, which I've never done before. I'm not a particularly fast reader, but I downloaded the audiobook and then put that on at triple speed and just listened to that while I was reading it, which allowed me to just concentrate and then just fly through the book.
Oh wow!
Which I strongly recommend if you want to read a book in a day.
That. So you're consuming it in two different ways. You're reading it and listening to it.
Yeah, the listening just made sure I could read for 5-ish hours straight without getting distracted. I had some breaks. It wasn't 5 hours straight, but
so I'm guessing you're not going to be reading the book of every film adaptation we do in the series then, the night before.
No. It was a bit of a late night for me watching the film. But I've always wanted to read the book. I just hadn't got around to it. And Also, like when I was like a teenager, I've always been really sensitive to spoilers. I hate having things spoiled. A friend of mine read the book and then told me in school, he was like, I could ruin the entire book by just saying the last 4 words of the book. And I was like, oh, please don't do that. and then I did start the book and I read like the first third, and someone else just accidentally spoiled the ending for me, and I just stopped. So I was like, oh, fuck this. But yeah, it feels good to finally get to grips with 1984, read the book and watch the better known movie adaptation of it.
So you weren't one of the many English students around the UK that ended up doing 1984 for some form of essay? Because I know lots of people which did 1984 for that kind of stuff.
No, but we did The Handmaid's Tale, which we will be talking about later this series. What else did we do? We did Handmaid's Tale and Lord of the Flies. What did you have to read at school?
I did, well, again, I picked from those few sort of sci-fi ones. So I did A Handmaid's Tale, and I compared it to A Time Machine.
Okay, cool. Oh, we didn't have a choice. We were like told what books we were studying that year.
Yeah, I think we had a few choices, and then it was kind of like you had to figure out what you were going to do. But yeah, oh, the good old days of English and studying at school. But speaking of sort of like English and subjects, and sort of like, we should talk about the history of this as well, because it's a book which is infamous. Like, this book was written in 1949 by George Orwell, and everybody knows it, right? Everybody knows some sort of reference from 1984. But I think it's important because at the time, it's depicting this dystopia, which is kind of like very close to what could have happened. Like, it's got elements of sort of like Stalinist Russia in there, and of course like Nazi Germany. And Orwell's kind of like putting a lot of the ideas that he was seeing at the time from these kind of like dictatorships and totalitarian sort of governments, and being like, right, what if this happened? What kind of things would we expect?
Yeah, it's what could have happened, and it's what literally was happening in Europe in particular at the time that he was writing this. It's horribly realistic and believable, and it's extremely grim and depressing. And it's not the opposite. I wouldn't describe it as the opposite of Brave New World, but it is the counterpoint to Brave New World, which is that like everyone is overdosed on a very superficial kind of love in Brave New World, and that keeps them pacified. And the driving force behind Oceana in 1984 is hatred, and particularly the film adaptation, which opens with the 2 minutes hate and just the screaming at the screen. That theme of hatred is really foregrounded, I think, in the film version.
Yeah, it's kind of like an interesting sort of juxtaposition between the two, because it's all ruled by like the idea of punishment, and sort of it's this surveillance that's happening in 1984, and everybody's being watched and everyone's under scrutiny. Whereas in A Brave New World, it's all about sort of like being free to an extent, because you can do what you want and you're happy, and there's sort of like there's nothing else, you've got no wants and needs. Whereas this is all about suppression. Like, all of the characters in this are suppressed and kept down, and they always sort of talk about like the boots that's stomping on you, and that is what 1984 is all about. This kind of like this government like laying the rules down and being like, right, you have to be like this, you have to do this.
And if you don't, then you are disappeared. Not even, well, you are killed, but it's more than killed. You are killed and then removed and annihilated from history. You cease to exist. And that's a really important theme of the film, is the nature of what exists and what the past is controlled by the party of Oceana, because they control people's minds, and if it exists or does not exist in people's minds, then they argue it does not exist at all.
Yeah, which is like, it's terrifying. It's kind of the same sort of concepts which we were looking at when we looked at Fahrenheit 451 and Equilibrium. It's this idea of changing history, and then if history doesn't exist, you've got nothing to learn from and nothing to sort of inform your decisions about the future. You only know what you are told.
But even as we grasp at victory, there is a cancer, an evil tumor growing, spreading in our midst.
Shout! Shout out his name!
The stylization of Oceania is like Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany, like we've said. Did you notice anything in particular? What was sort of like the big, like, this is what we're showing you on screen to sort of depict that it's Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany? What were the things that you noticed?
I felt like it was more on the society seemed more communist Russia to me, in the fact that everyone was, starving and like wearing the same outfits. That was more of a communist visual trope. I thought that there was not enough to go around, and everyone was kind of like forced to be the same with their like blue collar worker kind of outfits that they have to wear. But it's the slightly more Nazi idea of the leader. Although, I mean, Stalin kind of played that role as well in communist, early communist Russia, but I felt like Big Brother was much more of a Hitler character, giving these big, grandiose speeches that just get people riled up and angry at everyone. That's a more fascist Nazi view of the outside world. It's those two things mashed up. Like the treatment of the people seemed like depictions of communist Russia, but the world view was more Nazi fascist, I thought.
Yeah, and I mean, it's sort of like, it's all got that kind of like World War II tinge to it, hasn't it? Like, it looks like they're prisoners of war when they go to the canteens and things like that. And in terms of sort of like the motif of it, it looks very sort of Soviet, doesn't it? Just with like the reds everywhere on the signs and things like that. And they're all drinking, are they drinking vodka? Gin. So it's like they're drinking a big spirit, and they're all just drinking it all the time with whatever meal they're having. And that's kind of like, it's something you see in stereotypes around Russia, don't you? That they're always drinking vodka and like that's what they have. And it's like things like that are kind of at play in this film, I think, was sort of coming out.
There's something in it being gin as well. You're right, in depictions of Russia it would be vodka, but there's something quite British about gin, isn't there? Which gin is essentially just flavoured vodka, isn't it? But for it to be gin and not vodka, because there is this element of there isn't a fundamental element of Britishness as well. Like Oceania has destroyed Britain and the concept of Britain, and Oceania is much, much bigger than Britain. But there is a real Britishness to this because it's set in London, and the party is kind of like tapping into that. And again, that's a real world thing, like cherry picking the elements of historical nationalism to get people riled up and passionate about their country, but then destroying the elements of traditional nationalism and replacing them with your Nazi ideology or your communist ideology. We want you to be passionate about your country, but only to the extent that it works for us, supporting our political ideology. So yeah, just little things like that, like they drink gin, felt very British, that was the drink they were being served, even though it's like, it's clearly disgusting gin. They all hate it. You don't drink a shot of gin at lunchtime either at work. It's just sort of it's a means of sedating them with some fairly horrible alcohol.
Yeah, because they can't get their Soma or their Mezcal, so it's got to be gin. And yeah, like you're talking about the passion and stuff, that passion for the society, like comes out in that 2-minute speech of hate. Like that's the 2 minutes of hate is so sort of like, that's the opening scene, isn't it? And that's such a harrowing thing to start off with. Just all these people in unison screaming at a screen. And like, it's just, what kind of things did you notice during that? And like, what was your sort of like introduction into that world through that scene?
Just that idea that like the only kind of passion that's allowed in Oceania is hatred. There is no other kind of passion, and hatred kind of like just seeps into everyone. That it's the only really intense emotion that anyone's really supposed to be allowed to feel. O'Brien makes that quite explicit at the end of the film, that the party wants to destroy all pleasure, but Winston's kind of indoctrinated in it, even though like John Hurt's face, he's very reticent to the two minutes hate. He sort of participates when people are looking at him, but he's a bit reticent to join in. But later on, we see like the introduction of Julia, who he's going to fall in love with, he writes in his diary that, you know, his first reaction was, I hate her and I want to kill her before she outs me. She thinks I'm a thought criminal. I must kill her. He's fully indoctrinated, even though he's unhappy and he wants to rebel. He's got this rebellious nature, but he perhaps doesn't realise just how indoctrinated he is. He's got this natural hatred within him.
The fact that he's sort of like, he thinks he hates her and wants to kill her, but then he turns out to be in love with her. It's this kind of like double think thing that is at play throughout the film as well. This idea that it's one thing, but it's really another. Like that's it. The same with the ministries, because like the ministry of love is really a ministry of hate, because it's all about sort of like giving punishment, and then you've got like the ministry of truth, which is really just about controlling that. And there's some other ministries as well, aren't there?
Yeah. So what did you say? Ministry of Love, Ministry of Truth. There's the Ministry of Peace, which is obviously the war department that's running the perpetual war of this world. And then there's the Ministry of Plenty. And of course, everyone is starving and there is constant rationing. You know, we see in the film the chocolate allowance being cut from, I think it's cut from 30 to 25, but obviously the Ministry of Truth presents that as a raise from 20 to 25. So yeah, Ministry of Truth dealing with lies, Ministry of Plenty dealing with the rationing and the lack of food, and yeah, the Ministry of Peace, which is dealing with war.
And that all feeds back into the sort of like the final scene when it's sort of like the 2+2, like how many fingers am I holding up? The moment at the end, and he says like, if I say I'm holding 5, then what do you say? And it's kind of like, it's that control over the public mindset that this film is so focused on. And it's doing it in that interesting way at the start, where it's kind of like Winston doesn't know if he's feeling love or hate until somebody tells him what he's feeling. And at the start, it's kind of like he thinks he's feeling hate potentially because that's what he's supposed to feel, but later on, he's sort of like he realizes that's not the case.
I think he's genuinely feeling hatred because he thinks this woman is spying on him, and he thinks that she's going to have him killed. And I think it's real hatred that he feels, but at the same time, you're right that he's able to, that flips so quickly for him when this idea of love is introduced. And it's introduced in a very weird way, which is that Julia just hands him a note that says, I love you, which is sort of, I mean, it's ridiculous, isn't it? Like they've never spoken, they've just exchanged glances, but she's got this idea that like you can tell so much from a glance, and that's enough to risk their lives by passing a note that says, I love you.
I think it's also the fact that Winston obviously has an attraction to her from the start, because the way he looks at her, he doesn't look at her with kind of hate, at least not in the sort of like the filmic world. So you kind of get that impression that he's sort of like, he's still trying to figure out what he feels towards her. And he's kind of like inventing, like he's obviously suspicious of her because everybody is taught to be suspicious of everyone. Like you see a little boy or a little girl at the start when he's in his apartment, and you instantly think, oh, that kid's going to turn him in for something. And then later on, Winston is helping his neighbor out fix the sink. The kid says, you're a thought criminal. So again, there's like that constant like being wary of other people and that suspicious nature and kind of paranoia is all feeding into that.
Yeah, that kid's a little shit, isn't he? But you're right that particularly in this film adaptation, the way that they exchange glances is inherently romantic. The language of film is that those stolen glances mean these two characters fancy each other. I think it's more explicit in the book that he's extremely freaked out that a woman is looking at him because he just assumes that she's thought police, because that's all he's capable of thinking, really. But you're quite right that in a film adaptation, it has an inherently romantic implication.
Have you done this before?
Of course. Hundreds of times.
With party members?
Yes.
Inner party members?
Not with those bastards. Though there's plenty who would.
Look, I hate purity. I hate goodness. I don't want virtue to exist anywhere. I want everyone corrupt.
Well, I ought to suit you then. I'm corrupt to the core.
Do you like doing this? I don't mean just me.
I adore it.
So you've got these two characters which are kind of like in the midst of starting a relationship. But like, again, talking about the background of the society, they're constantly at war, aren't they? And the media is just hammering home that fact constantly. The fact that their fighters are out there fighting the good fight, and they need to be doing what they're doing on the assembly lines and whatever jobs they're doing in order to keep things running so that everything can be moving towards eventual peace, a peace which they know will never come.
A peace that is defined only as victory, really. The war is the point of it is not to achieve peace as much as it is to achieve victory. And again, it comes back to the nature of hatred. We don't want to be at peace with Eurasia or East Asia. They're interchangeable, that we're at war with. We want to conquer and vanquish them, and laugh at their loss and their death and scream at them. That's all they really want out of the war, and that's the point of this perpetual war, is kind of engendering that feeling in people, that stoking that flame of hatred so that you're always on side with the party.
Yeah, and having that sort of like that innate hatred of something you don't know as well is just, again, it's like another form of control, because if they can't think anything else other than hate, they're always going to have those feelings. They're going to be easier to manipulate, because anger is such a strong emotion. If they're tapping into that, then it's kind of like, it's also an emotion which you can't reason with anger a lot of the time. Like these are people which are being manipulated to act in a way without reason in a lot of ways.
Yeah, they're not invited to think for themselves. The party is going to tell them what to think and how to feel. I really, really love the character of Parsons, his neighbour, the guy whose house he goes and unblocks the drain, but then he's like, he just sort of shows up everywhere, and he's totally like bought in, and he's kind of a bit of a simpleton. He's just very happy with like getting on with things, and like, oh yeah, we got to crush Goldstein, and then to have him kind of show up at the end in the prison cell, just absolutely amazing. Like, it's such a good little moment where he's like, oh, you better stay away from me, I'm a thought criminal. I'm an agent of Goldstein. I'm so sorry. Like, you just feel so bad for him, but he's just like not capable of any thought of his own. He's not a rational person in any sense.
Yeah, he just doesn't even know what he's been doing either. He's just sort of, again, he's just been swept away in what the government's told him to do, and it's just like led him into that position. But he's sort of like, for him to be so happy and sort of like, he seems quite like happy to go along with the flow. But he's living in these working conditions, which are, like we said, they're like prisoner of war camps, aren't they? They're sort of like, they're very much like a prison. Everything about this place is grimy and dirty and grey, and like the worst depiction of England you can ever have. Like, it's always rainy, there's puddles everywhere. It's like, it's how you picture dystopias.
Well, that's true.
I mean, that's true. I mean, I'm looking out the window now and it's a bit grey, but it's definitely not 1984.
Right. No, it's an incredibly depressing film to look at. I mean, I love the production design of this. The costumes are great. They've just got these sort of ugly matching jumpsuits that they're all in. Just all the walls are grey and crumbling apart. And the streets, when he goes to the proles town or where they live, where it's basically just rubble everywhere and stuff's just getting like shelled at the sky. It's just so bleak. But it looks fantastic. It looks a lot like Brazil at times, which came out the following year.
Yep.
And I think took some influence from the production design. You can really see if Terry Gilliam directed 1984, it would look like Brazil, right?
Yeah, because especially the office scene where you see Winston in his little cubicle, that's something which we'll talk about when we talk about Brazil later in the series. There's definitely a scene like that I remember. But it's also this sort of like this griminess, this aesthetic that they're going for. It's the like predominant thing that you think of when you think of dystopias, and it's also just like war so much in the forefront of people's minds, and then having this dystopia look war-torn kind of adds to that, because you can't escape this feeling of war happening, because you feel like you're in a prisoner of war camp. You see these buildings which look like they've been shelled and blown up. Everything is reminding them, like all the media is saying, like, the soldiers out there, that we're fighting the good fight. You can't get away from the idea that this war is still happening. But when they go out of London and you see the greenery and the forests and the woods, it's a completely different story. It looks untouched by this apparent war that's happening. And it's such like a juxtaposition between those two worlds.
Yeah, what did you think about those scenes where they go out into the outside of London and have this love affair, basically? What did you think about the nature of love and romance in this film and in Oceania, especially like what we talked about in comparison with Brave New World as well?
Well, the way that they're sort of like, they're making it seem like a dirty little secret, but at the same time, the fact that they have that first meeting in the woods is kind of like they're going back to nature and back to the way that humanity was supposed to live before. Just sort of like, it's all sort of like back to basics. We're in the woods and we're having sex. We're sort of like, we're going back to the primal stuff. But also there's something sort of like, it's everything there is the opposite to this dystopian society that they're living in. So they're not in these like cramped, dirty apartments. They're in the fresh air, in the woods, free. There's nobody else there. They've kind of got their privacy, and it's just like it's a completely different kind of world for them. So it was interesting that that's where it was. But also I was kind of thinking, if that's what they have just outside of the boundaries of like London, why aren't there more people living outside of this world?
Because you are simply not allowed, I guess. The party just simply wouldn't allow that. You would be vanished and executed if you tried to do that. That'd be deviancy of some sort.
Oh, I'd definitely be a deviant out there in the woods in my little shack.
And of course they think they've got absolute privacy there, but we later find out there's, the thought police have got all these photos of them. They were clearly being tracked. I think the idea is that it's like, because they're in the trees, there can't be any microphones here, but evidently there were, and there was some sort of surveillance there that they simply weren't aware of. But they do bring their romance back into the city, don't they? They try and live like a little family unit in that flat above the shop. It obviously doesn't work out for them, but they bring the love back into the dinginess of London in 1984.
Yeah, it's like when they go into that and they hire out that little apartment room, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because it kind of made me think of like UK soaps and things like that. I kept thinking of Coronation Street for some reason, and like, wow. And then also like I had visions of. Have you seen the ITV adaptation of Goodnight, Mr. Tom?
No.
Like it's all set in that sort of like era, and the fact that you've got like this washerwoman outside and she's singing and she's like on the like cobble streets almost, and then you've got them in their little flat, which is like. It's obviously it's run down because that's just the nature of the city, but they kind of make it cozy. They're in a bed. They've got like coffee and jam sandwiches, and it's just sort of this nice little getaway for them. And it's this piece of the old world that they can live in and sort of be free and just run around naked, because they're just naked the whole time they're in that room, aren't they?
And I've got a loaf of bread, proper white bread, and jam, a real tin of milk. In a party, 1/2 kilo.
How did you manage to get hold of all this?
Oh, there's nothing those bastards don't have.
I thought it was interesting that these two films, these two stories, 1984 has got this foundation of hatred, and Brave New World's got this foundation of not love exactly, but lust, I guess, and sort of pleasure, at least pleasure. But they both reach the same conclusion. These two societies reach the same conclusion about love and romance and monogamy, which is that it's a dirty thing. It's a problem for a dystopia's control of the society. You're not allowed to feel proper romantic love, and that will be punished. So even though they go in these two different routes to establishing the dystopia, both of the dystopias seem to agree that love is a problem. love and emotion is a problem for dystopian control.
So why do you think that is the case then? Why is like love and emotion such a bad thing for this society and this totalitarian government?
I think it's like you need to lack the emotion to just blindly obey everything, and that stops you from engaging too critically, I guess, although that doesn't entirely make sense, because if you're not overcome with emotion, then you should be thinking more critically, but people don't. But I guess Equilibrium sets it out right, doesn't it? That the emotions lead to violence and resistance, and then you would rise up and fight against the dystopia.
I suppose they want people which are malleable as well. And if you start thinking and having emotions, you get your own opinions and you have the things that you want to do. And that sort of like will lead to potential problems.
And O'Brien sets it out as the only love that is allowed is love of Big Brother. We want you to love the party. The party's all that matters. And any individualism that you are experiencing through your emotions are a problem for that, because your love should be for Big Brother and the party is everything. It should consume your whole existence.
So the fact that emotions aren't really allowed as well is kind of like it feeds back into the way people are communicating as well. And the whole idea of newspeak that the sort of like the film and the book are talking about is kind of restricting the way that people communicate with each other. So again, it's restricting emotion, it's restricting sort of like expressing yourself. So newspeak is a slimmed down version of the dictionary, which is getting progressively smaller and smaller until they want it to only be like the words which are needed. So it'd be like yes, no, very simple dialect. So you can't be expressive in what you're talking about. You can't use your vocabulary to get your point across because there is no vocabulary in this idea of newspeak. What did you think about that and sort of what they were doing there? It's
such an amazing concept, like that they are literally just using the nature of language to reduce your ability to even think. Because once newspeak is finally the lingua franca of Oceania, then there will be like there just wouldn't be a word for love, or if the word love still existed, it would only be used in the context of love for Big Brother. So you couldn't even formulate a thought. Like romance wouldn't exist as a word, so you couldn't even formulate your thoughts around the concept enough to fully experience or to fully process what you were feeling if you did start to feel that. And of course, you would never start to feel that because you are trained to recognize when you might be starting to feel that and realize that that is a thought crime, and then stop yourself in your tracks. Use your double think to accept that you are feeling that way, and then realize that you are not feeling that way, and then hold both those things to be true, and then get on with your life. All of that stuff just packed into this, what is an incredibly simple fictional language. I thought that was so good, especially like in the book, and comparing it to, when I think of fictional languages, I automatically think of Tolkien's Elvish, which is famously very complicated because he was a linguist and he created all these real working languages. Orwell's creating, in my opinion, a much more interesting fictional language by creating something that is massively more simplistic than any real language. It's the opposite of a real language. It's a reduced language. But I think it's a much more interesting concept in doing that.
It's mad, isn't it? Can you imagine listening to a podcast in just newspeak? It would be
double plus and good.
Yeah, there would be that. It would just be like so concise and to the point, and it would have no expression in it. I don't think you could do it. It'd be like 5 minutes long and just, very to the point.
Yeah, and of course, podcasts are all about opinions, and that would not be allowed. So it would just boil down to, thought crime or crime stop, and then that would be the end of the podcast. But I couldn't get my head around so there's this great character who is working on the next volume of the Newspeak dictionary, which will be the definitive dictionary of Newspeak, and then Newspeak will replace Oldspeak, which is English. He was a great character because he's so bought into it and he's so passionate about Newspeak. But I just couldn't understand how a Newspeak dictionary would work, because like the whole point of Newspeak is that every word is self-explanatory, apart from, well, not all of them, but stuff like we no longer have the word fantastic because we will use the word plus good or double plus good, and that means fantastic or brilliant. So in a Newspeak dictionary, under the entry double plus good, what is then written next to it explaining what that means? Do you know what I mean? Like if you look in a dictionary for the word brilliant, you then find a description in English of the word brilliant, but in Newspeak, you can't then describe double plus good because you would have to use Old Speak to explain what it meant. And the point is we're trying to eliminate Old Speak. So what does a dictionary look like in Newspeak?
That's
How does
mad,
it read?
isn't it? Yeah. Like it's just got to be like a bunch of words that don't fully get described.
Just one final thing on Newspeak from the book, which is not translated at all into the film, is that at the very end of the book there's an appendix, which is an essay by George Orwell on Newspeak explaining what Newspeak is and how it works. So that plan is to make Newspeak the language of Oceania by 2050. That's when they think they're going to roll it out by. But some people interpret the essay at the end of the book as a happy ending for the book. So obviously the story does not have a happy ending at all. But then this essay is kind of written in universe and it uses the past tense. So it's like the language of Oceania was Newspeak and they wanted to implement it by 2050. So it seems to be talking as if Oceania failed to implement Newspeak and therefore presumably no longer exists as a state. So it seems to be implying that this essay might be written from a time even further in the future than 1984 and Oceania failed. That might be reading too much into it and it's just Orwell's writing style, but you know, there's something there about people have kind of hooked onto this as a possibly happy ending, that there's this appendix about Newspeak in a past tense.
Oh, that's an amazing idea, and I like that as well because like it is so bleak. Like you're talking about the ending of this film, like it all leads up to like that sort of terrible conclusion, and like throughout it, you've got that sense of foreboding because you know that everything is being manipulated by the government, but you do like we were talking about that little flat / apartment that Winston is living in with Julia, like during the week. That is their sort of like little escape. But like you said, when Big Brother finally rears its ugly head behind the picture that they've got up, it just pops off, and then they've suddenly got this big TV screen. That's sort of like it all just creeps in, doesn't it? And then you get that kind of like, how can they get out of this? They're literally like completely naked in the middle of this room. You can't explain this away. They've got all of the evidence of all the stuff they've been eating and what they've been doing. It's like, they're in a predicament, aren't they? There's sort of no way out.
I thought what was quite interesting that I noticed, particularly watching the film, was that because there is such foreboding, that's almost a bit of doublethink on the part of the characters, that they say like, this can't end well, this won't end well, we will be killed, we will be tortured, and we will give each other up. But they continue anyway because they're in love. That's almost like a kind of doublethink, isn't it? That they don't do the sensible thing, which is stop seeing each other. And I also kind of felt like it invites a little bit of doublethink from the audience, which is that when I was reading the book, the ending was spoiled, so I knew it wasn't going to be a happy ending. What were you feeling? Did you think there was going to be a happy ending? Or did you kind of know that it was going to end badly?
I kind of couldn't tell because I'm thinking about when I first sort of saw the film, and I think because it's so ingrained into you that there will be a happy ending with this kind of stuff. When you see that it doesn't work out that way, it services this idea more because it's, if this was allowed to happen, if you lived in this totalitarian state and there was no way out, this is how bleak it would be. There would be no happy ending because this is the society that you've allowed to be created. So I think it's important that it has that message that this will not end well and cannot end well. But in sort of like, in opposition to that, the way Winston talks about the human spirit and human emotion, and just like, you can't stamp that out as much as you try. I think that's really important as well.
Well, yes, but the fact that he is saying that right, seemingly to the bitter end, he's strapped to that table and he's still saying like, no, you can't crush the human spirit. It's still, I think it's inviting this double think in the audience, which is that you're hoping for a happy ending. You want them to get together. You want them to be in love. And then Winston's saying all that stuff. So you're still saying, yeah, Winston's right. You can't crush the human spirit. But then they do. They literally do. That's what happens to Winston. I feel like you're being pushed into this double think the whole way, which is thinking that there's any kind of possible happy ending for any of these characters. If you feel that way at all watching the film or reading the book, then you're doing a double think, because you're told all the way through this is going to end badly. This can't end well. Winston writes in his diary, I will be killed. I'll be killed. These are the writings of a dead man or something, is what he says, like from a dead man speaking to the future, something like that.
I think it's like you think of it more like the next group of people, because it's like they can't stamp it out because it's going to happen again. And then it could be the next people that make their way out of the society or sort of like change it in some way. So it's kind of like that glimpse of hope that Winston is referring to. Like, even though he may be crushed, and like he may be sort of like beaten down into that point where there's no return, it doesn't mean that it'll be the same for other people.
Hatred and fear have no life. Why is hate less vital than love?
I don't know. But somehow you'll fail. Something will defeat you. Life will defeat you.
We control life at all levels. We create human nature. Men are infinitely malleable.
I mean, let's talk about how cruel that like torture is for Winston as well, because that is absolutely brutal. Like the rat cage on his face, that's the thing which really got me.
So Room 101, yeah. I have to admit, like, we were talking about like the kind of all of the little phrases and stuff and double think and newspeak and thought crimes. These have all entered the kind of public consciousness, and obviously Room 101 has as well. But so much of it has, and to not even mention Big Brother, but so much of it has that when I was reading the book yesterday, until Room 101 came in at the end, I completely forgot that Room 101 had anything to do with 1984. But this place where your worst fear exists and you'll be confronted by it is such a terrifying concept. And yeah, the rat cage is really, really horrific. What they do to Winston at the end there. And it's after all the physical torture as well. It's like he has been through hell, truly been through hell. He is ruined and broken, but they've still got one more level because we have invaded your privacy so much that we know how to get you from the inside, which is what Julia says they can never do. Like, they can't get into your heart. They can't get you on the inside, but of course they can. Yeah. And again, it's that double thing, isn't it? It's like, they're saying she thinks it's not going to happen, but actually, yeah, they've got you covered.
On a slightly different tangent, but sort of like still relating to sort of those torture scenes, the whole sort of like the 2 + 2 = 5 thing. Like, I was doing some reading, and that was taken from some Soviet propaganda. Like, it was on a poster, 2 + 2 = 5, because it was referring to the 5-year plan and being like, we're going to get there sooner than 5 years if we all put in the effort, and sort of having that in there amongst all this other stuff, which I thought was like another sort of like interesting layer to it. The fact that it's got that relevance to what was actually happening at the time when like Orwell was writing.
And interestingly, in the film, Winston, at the very end, he writes 2 + 2 = on the table in the dust, but he doesn't finish the equation. In the book, he does. He writes 2 + 2 = 5. He's completely done in the book. But I felt like in the film, by not showing him complete the equation, there was a little bit of a question mark over what he truly felt and what he truly believed, right? Because I wasn't so sure in the film, I guess, that he was as broken as he is in the book.
Yeah, because even his conversation with Julia is kind of like, you feel like there's something there's definitely something unsaid going between them. They're going through the motions of saying what they have to say to each other, But yeah, the fact that they're both able to be in a position where they can still talk to each other, I don't know, there was still sort of like that sort of like doubt in your head as to what will happen next.
I feel like this film presents it with ever so slightly more hope. Maybe that's because they couldn't include the appendix about Newspeak, which has this sort of potentially uplifting message, whereas the actual end of the narrative is so bleak in the book. Maybe framing it very slightly differently in the film allows leaving that window very slightly open, as Orwell does with the appendix in the book.
Yeah, I mean, it still is slight. Like, he's still sort of like, he's in that bar with the waiter in the same way that he saw the other people earlier in the film. It's kind of like, yeah, you know what he's been through because he's in that place, and yeah, you just can't see how things are going to get better because it's very depressing.
Well, things won't get materially better for Winston, but the potential of a happy ending is if he finished that equation as 4, then they haven't broken him on the inside. That's the only potential happy ending for Winston, is if he can die intellectually free.
Yeah.
So by not finishing that equation, we don't actually get a final say on what's in his heart. But then the voiceover, he does say, "I love you," and he's saying that with Big Brother basically talking to him over the telescreen. So I'm not sure how they wanted to kind of craft the message at the end of the film.
Yeah. I mean, also part of me is glad that his story didn't end with his face getting eaten by a bunch of rats. So what are your big takeaways from these two films then, Matt? Like, it's quite bleak in both cases, but what do you think we've learned sort of like so far about dystopias with these two?
I guess it's the danger of suppressing individuality, right? That's what both of these films do. They do it in different ways, but neither way works out well for society, whether it's through pleasure or hatred. It ends up bad for society to try and suppress individuality.
Yeah, and I think it's the whole sort of idea about either like sexual control as well, like whether it's repression or liberation. It's kind of both of these films are dependent on that, and sort of like people's emotions towards each other and different connections. It's all that kind of thing, which is like feeding into these dystopias and how these governments are controlling their societies.
Yeah, they're both pretty bleak futures, aren't they, James? We can only hope that there's more hope for the next generation, the youth of tomorrow.
Yeah, we can only hope the kids are all right, but they aren't all right. No. Next week, we are going to be looking at the theme of the kids aren't all right. There's something going on. There's something bad happening to the kids of the new generation. And to do that, we've got a couple of great films. One film, which Matt has never seen before. What's that film?
Yeah,
Matt?
I've got a slight problem here, James, because it's another film that I haven't seen because I wanted to read the book first. So I think I'll be downloading another audiobook this week.
Yep, Matt's going to wade through another book.
And that book is Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange, as adapted by the great Stanley Kubrick. Really, really looking forward to seeing that. And I guess reading it as well. And we'll be pairing that up with Battle Royale, based on the book by Kushin Takami, I think, which I have read. So I don't need to read that this week.
Oh, fantastic. Glad you haven't got too much on your reading list for next week. And of course, to help us discuss these two films, these two horrific, violent, disgusting films, we had to get someone who was equally horrific, disgusting, and violent. Of course, that is not the case. It is our good friend Michael Munzer from The Evolution of Horror. He will be our first guest of the series. He'll be joining us next week.
But until then, if you like the show and you want more, as we mentioned in the middle there, you can come and join us on patreon.com/journeythroughsci-fi to get some more bonus content there.
And if you don't want to sign up to Patreon, you can't afford it, or you just don't want to, you can always go onto your podcasting app of choice and give us a lovely review. 5 stars always goes down very well, so please feel free to do that.
And let us know in your review what thought crimes you've committed. We won't tell anyone.
And of course, if you
Actually, don't. Oh my God, I don't want to hear that.
Okay, so don't do that. But if you want to keep it a bit more secret, you can go onto our Facebook discussion group and tell us about it on there. And tell the rest of the Journey Through Sci-Fi community all about that. And of course, we're also on Twitter, Instagram. We've got a website. Just look up @Through Sci-Fi or @Through Sci-Fi Pod. You'll be able to find us there and have a chat. So that's it for this week. Me and Matt are off to take our Soma and check for video cameras and microphones in our houses. We will see you again next time.